Well, I hope everybody can hear me. I'm not used to public speaking, but I'll do the best I can under the circumstances. We moved down to the Milo area in 1962. We took over on the 1st of July, beginning of the financial year. And, well, the reason for us moving was that my brother had four sons eventually, and so did I, and we were in partnership with Dad, and we only had 8,000 acres, and that was not considered enough area for one man to survive on sheep. So there comes a time when you have to part company, and the other reason was too that there was hardly any children in the area anymore. I don't know whether you know where Mount Mary is, but it's about 15 miles west of Morgan, which is on the bend of the River Murray, where the Murray makes its southerly direction. And it's in the 8-inch rainfall area, well, not always. And so it was quite a change to come down to a district where we had about 4 times the amount of rain that we were used to. But the property we bought was just under 100 acres. There was quite a bit of scrub on it still. It was poorly managed. Well, I don't know if we manage it much better now, but there wasn't a blade of grass on the place in the middle of winter. The cows were skinny as could be. I was going to say skinny as crows, but I think the crows would have been a lot fatter than the cows. The udders hung down like gloves on the point of calving. So we had a bit of a raw start. Everything was, the soil and that was down hard. You get rains and it would flush all the organic matter and animal waste down the creek. So there wasn't, the soil was about an inch deep before it got to the white sandy underneath it before it got down to the clay line. So we had a bit of a problem getting up and running. The one thing that did quite well was the blackberries. They still do. But when they initially tried to clear the place, they cut the stumps off about so high. I think the idea might have been so they could pull them out with a tractor, but that didn't get done. And so the blackberries grew around it, and you could hardly drive a tractor between the blackberries and stumps. So we had to do something about that. But the method we attacked it with was we had a drag saw. Colin Whitkey knows all about the drag saw. I think he ended up with it. He still got it. Yeah. An engine on one end with a crank on it, and it had a crosscut saw at the far end. And when the engine was going, it worked the saw. But the beauty of that saw was that you could angle it in any direction you wanted to. So, well, if we can't get them out, we'll cut them off. So we get a crowbar and get the old saw going in and chiseling away and drive a wedge in so the saw wouldn't get jammed. And we eventually got the place reasonably clear. I think we ended up with about 100 tonne of wood on the place, cut it out with a tractor and a 2-wheel trailer sort of thing. So it was a bit of a raw start. The other problem we had was that the dairy had been burnt out. Well, the milking machine worked, but there wasn't any wall in it. There was still a roof over it. There was an electric copper there that did work. And the milk board at that time wasn't the milk authority as now. And they graciously allowed us to produce milk, provided that we built a new dairy. Well, we didn't have much finance, and it took us about 4 years before we eventually got the dairy built. But one thing that did there was that we never had the site levelled, so we used the hill as to an advantage. So we built up in the dairy yard high enough so we could get a tanker underneath this effluent spout to tanker the liquid manure out into the paddocks. But going back to the paddocks themselves, still amazes me the variety of stones on that paddock. The houses are virtually in the corner of the property near the road. That's got ironstone around that. There's a bit of gully on the next hill up there. That's got ironstone on it. The one down the gully and up the far end of the property near the road, that's got a bit of sandstone on it. Then if you go back towards the far corner opposite the house, there's a little rise there with a bit of slate stone on it. Then you go up the back corner, the far corner, and there's a bit of quartz stone there with a bit of iron in it. Then there's a bit of a dip again, and there's another sandy peak up there, and that's got sandstone on it. And doesn't seem to be much clay around that at all. But there's another hill with a gully between it. It's almost in the centre of the property there, just above David's house now. And that's got quartz stone. And when I say quartz stone, it had quartz stone. There was almost no soil there at all. And that particular hill had a regrowth of stringy barks from seedlings, and it was as dense as you could make it, and as straight as a rod. We were short of a cow, and we was looking for this cow, and we found two of them in there eventually that had calves. But later on we had the stringies knocked down and cleared that up. But that ridge had more or less quartz stone right through to the other boundary fence then. But near the, what's the laneway now, there was some conglomerate stone. All tiny little pebbles sort of welded into great big rocks. And then there was another type of stone. I've got a sample of it here. It'll be passed around. Anybody can give me a name of that sort of stone? So there's only a tiny little patch of that. So we had stone problems, we had stumps problems, and when you try to work the land, you got a bit of an idea what that is. I mean, the soil was so shallow all over, and most of the water just zip off the top, so we had to do something about it. We got a neighbour to work up a bit of land. We thought, well, on the slope, a bit of a gravelly slope sort of thing, we plant a bit of loose and with a cover crop of oats. Well, it didn't do particularly well, and the trouble was that the soil was that barren underneath. Lucern's supposed to be a deep-rooted plant, but the roots were all around the surface. When I was quite interested in Yeoman's keyline farming method. There was almost a perfect example of that down Mount Compass Way. I don't know if you ever heard of it or not, but his idea was to have dams built up fairly high in the gullies and had a catchment drain to the dams, and then have a valve in the bottom of the dam so you could have an irrigating channel below the dam, and you can flood irrigate your slopey country that way. I mean, a simple method of getting the water out the channel was just to have a canvas with a pole on one end and a couple of chains and the pegs on the other end. You could throw that over the channel, put your foot on the canvas when it was pegged down, and the water would hit the canvas and overflow the channel, so you could ship that along the panel. I thought it was a perfect, easy way of irrigation and very cheap and effective way, I think. But our property wasn't really big enough for that sort of thing. But we did take up trying to work on the contour to aerate the soil and slow down the water. But the problem is we used Yeoman's chisel plough, And because his theory was that if you put this plough into the ground and break it up and sort of break the underground surface to make it more porous and that. But the trouble was that, well, with a little old Dexter and the hard ground in the summertime, you just sort of scratched a few little indentations in the ground, and it didn't work that well, so we decided we'd have to do it in the winter time when the soil was wet to get it. Well, the problem was that the plants that did grow the roots were that shallow and matted together, the whole lot turned over instead of just made aerated the soil as it was, so that wasn't particularly successful in itself. But coming from a low rainfall area to a high rainfall area, we had advice of the Department of Ag, as it was called at the time, and they advised us to use super and the normal chemical fertilisers. Well, that did help to make things grow. But the problem was there that it was, well, not real healthy growth, but we got height and got a bit of bulk and that. But the problem was that the red-leg earth mite and the lucerne flea took more than their fair share of it. So, oh, well, you had to spray. And that was around about the time DDT came out. So we're advised to use that. Well, the first spray, that first year, made a good kill. Next year, we should spray twice, you know. And I could see there's something wrong, but when we got the new dairy mobile, we tankered out the liquid manure off the yard, and we spread that out on the paddock. Well, and immediately the grass and whatever grew was a more healthy colour green, and was outstanding. You could see, you know, wherever you went from a distance, had the differences in the grass between where it had it and where it didn't have it. But the other thing that I did notice in there that sort of changed my whole outlook towards it was that the damage where the manure went was minimal compared to where it didn't have any. So it sort of made me think, after all, is that nature's way of getting rid of the poor pasture, and then they didn't bother about the better quality stuff. So I worked out that, well, we had a real soil problem, and the lack of organic matter in it, lack of aeration in it, and all that sort of set my quite different attitude to what we were doing. So, well, we did have a little old truck, and the old Dexter, we had and the Super Dexter it was, a diesel one at that time. And we had a front end loader put on it, about 3 times the size of a wheelbarrow. And that was a period when the broiler chicken sheds were sort of coming in. And, well, they had to clean out, so they'd put shavings and sawdust in it for the chickens to work on. They only had dirt floors in it, and with every batch of chickens that went out, well, they had to be all cleaned out. Well, they were quite happy to get rid of it. Well, seeing we were short of manure and organic matter on the place, we carted I don't know how many tons of this stuff out, but it wasn't quite to what the organic farmers would do. We put it straight on the pasture raw, because chicken manure is a little bit hot, and you could see where it burned off the pasture around the edges where it happened to get too much. But well, eventually it rotted down, and with a bit of irrigation. I was talking about the irrigation. The place was actually advertised as having irrigation on it. Well, there was a pump on the Onkaparinga across the road with a 2-inch rusty pipe to it. It had a 2.5, 3 Kelly loose with a 10 horsepower motor on it. But it went up top of the hill. They did actually have a concrete base to build a tank on it, but that didn't happen. But then from the top of the hill down the gully and back up towards the dairy, there was an inch rusty pipe there, and it would take 10 minutes to fill a 10-gallon can. And that pump, when we eventually did get some decent piping there, 4-inch for a start and 3-inch there, and with outlets for irrigation, it could handle about 5,000 or 6,000 gallons an hour, or up to 8 gallons an hour, running about 24 sprinklers. So, it was slightly restricted in its original form. But no, we put in 1,100 feet of plastic piping there for a start. And I think when we put the soil back in the trench, I think we found 2 earthworms. It was, the ground, the soil and that was that poor. But over the years, when we eventually did use the yeoman machine in wetter weather and that, we did get a bit more water into the soil and a bit more air into it, and it did work. It started to really grow something a bit more likely to a worthwhile pasture and that. You could feed the tines down as they wore off, and a very abrasive sort of ground, and they did wear off. But it didn't sort of do the job that I particularly liked, so we went to the Wallace machine. It's got a low, well, it's a rigid tine machine with shear bolts in it. We had plenty of stumps and things to bust those. And the low profile machine shear went into the ground and lifted it up and passed, and then you kept your speed down. It would fall back, but it left mini terraces around with this knife edge in the centre of it. And that slowed the water down, and we didn't lose the organic matter that from the cows and waste and that. So you can see how rough and rigid it is. It's not ideal for cutting hay, I'll have to admit. But if one was to drive the tractor over that, the tractor would press it quite flat again. So the idea is to leave it up as long as you can to get that air into the soil. You could stick your hand in either way, right down there. But when we got the Kubota 4-wheel drive, big wheels on the front sort of thing, so it's quite a tractor about twice the size of the old Super Dexter.
You want a drink, dear?
No, she's right. We could adjust the depth wheel so it would really go down. And the method we're using now is we crawl along it almost a slow walk, load the tractor down. That mat is on the point to spin, and if we run into some of these rocks and stumps, well, you're likely to be able to stall it before you break a shear bolt. So that's what we've been doing. Being sick for a couple of years, 3 years, it hadn't been done, but the intention was to run this through every year just to lift it up, because running the manure tanker out on there, that rolls it down and the cows pat it down. We didn't want to sort of seal it off again like it was originally. So we've had our problems on the place, and because cows were such a poor state when we moved there, we should have framed our first milk check instead of cashed it. But no, we've still got quite a bit of trees on the property, some quite nice trees, but the wind seems to keep us in firewood, because it's all that big stack of wood that we originally had on there, that's eventually disappeared. Some of it was sold. And that's the dairy there. The idea of, you can see how, just go back one if you can. You can see the tanker underneath the spout there. But that silly looking roof there is quite, well, one of my bright ideas. we can put hay up in the loft, and then it can just gravitate down through the feed to the feeder while the cows were milking. We have never fed grain. The only reason really why we don't call ourselves organic is because we're still buying hay from conventional farms where they use the traditional artificial fertilisers and sprays and that sort of thing. But no, when we first came there, we had to cart out the hay out into the scrub where there was a bit of protection and that. Well, it didn't take long in a wet winter where you had not wheel tracks coming up and down the hill. There were creeks. So we had to do something different about that. So you can see the method of those contour marks on the side of the hill there. Work on the contour to slow the water down, but where there's a creek, I'll make a fall, like on that hill on the left-hand side there. I'll make about an 8% fall around the hill to try and keep the water up there as long as it can be, so it's got time to soak in and make best use of it. But when we built the hay shed, we had the veranda and a concrete pad there, so we could slide the hay out from the hay shed into the feeder, and it was a lot better than carting it out in the shump. That's the old John Deere that we bought second hand. I don't know whether that was quite the wise thing to do, but well, when you can't afford something better, anything's better than that. And, the other problem that's part of the hay shed there with the Wallace machine tail end there on the Kubota. But you get a build up of hay and waste and manure around the feeders and that. When our manure spreader wasn't working order, we used to cart that out and put it out, and that certainly made a difference to the quantity and quality of growth of the pasture. One thing that I did manage to get hold of was a tractor contour meter. It's a little round gadget, come from down the southeast actually, stockers and shearers I think. I just don't remember how we got onto that, whether it was through Yeoman or where, but that mounted on the tractor, and you can adjust it so that you can know whether you're working on the contour or whether you've got a rise or a fall. So I can know that I did 8% fall around the hill to keep the water from running straight down the creek sort of thing. Blackberries we try and keep in control with the slasher. We haven't used any artificial fertiliser or sprays, weedicides for the last 42 or 3 years or whatever. We don't get a real big lush bulk of feed, but I think the quality is better. Another thing that when we moved onto the place when the ground was as poor as could be, in the springtime it was this happy yellow colour, capeweed. Well, it's got fairly big leaves and it lies flat on the ground and it'll smother out anything else. And it's got a sort of a sourish smell about it. And, well, how do you get rid of that? But when we started to get the soil back into operation again, more healthy soil, aerated and a bit of organic matter, that sort of gradually dies away. The same with sorrel. You get in the springtime, you get that sort of goldy little tinge across the paddocks. Some quite appreciate the herb of that, but I got a job to find it when one lady asked me for some the other day. They disappear. And another one that was very prominent in the hard ground was nutweed. It's got a pretty little mauve flower and it's got not really leaves but little sort of spiny things. You can hear it zip through the cow's teeth tongue when they try and eat it. They can't get anything out of it. But if you stop and think, that little nut that grows in the ground on this hard ground, when that dies, that leaves a little air pocket in the soil. So it's nature's way of trying to aerate the soil. Same with the old dock. That only grew in the creekways where it was really wet and sour. But when we started getting a bit of moisture and water into the property, that started to grow anywhere, even on top of the hills. But the paddock just out from the dairy there, Secretary of the Soil Association came out there with a donkey club, I think, one day. And he said, "Harry, what are you going to do with that dock and that paddock?" That's the paddock there. And I said, "Well, maybe if the soil comes good, it'll disappear." Now, I'll challenge anybody to find more than about 2 dock on that bit of dirt there now. It just went away. So weeds got that indication of soil problems, and they only grow on a soil that suits them. I mean, if you get soil that's been overworked, and that first thing it'll grow is a bit of wireweed, a hogweed. But there's very little of that now. I mean, we still got a bit of capeweed in places, but the what we call the dry land is where we haven't irrigated. I mean, it's all set up to, well, not all of it, but most of it's set up to irrigate. But that hasn't had the manure and everything on it, but that's not nearly as progressed as well as what the other ground where we concentrated on, because when you water ground, you want something to grow. You got the cost of that. So, but anything that could go wrong went wrong, and probably our management was up to what could have been or should have been, but we certainly did things different to what most of the folk in the district have done. I've seen potato growers, they work the ground up, they have their potato rows going downhill so that the water will drain so it doesn't rot the potatoes. But when you get a heavy rain, the soil goes down the creek and they got to scoop it back up in the gutters and that sort of thing. So even when it comes to making hay, you often get caught out with it. You get your hay and you get a wind and it's up against the fence and that sort of thing. So I had a bright idea. I'd go to silage, because that doesn't matter if it gets wet. Had a pit pushed out with a dozer, and well, when you've got a forager behind it, a little old Dexter tractor, and a trailer carrying the fodder behind that, and you're going through a pit and dumping the stuff there, you've got a problem sometimes to getting bogged in the pit with all your gear. So you have to keep on rolling it down and firming it down. Well, the silage turned out all right. We put plastic over it and tyres to hold the plastic down and a bit of sawdust on it, you know. But when it comes to getting the jolly stuff out in the winter time, you got your grab on the front, but there's not much weight on the back of the tractor, and it's wet and boggy. So eventually we discarded that idea, you know. Trial and error seems to be the thing that we did most of, and success sort of come very slowly. But no, we haven't. I mean, the idea was cows and that you had to deworm them regularly and do all this sort of thing. Well, once the soil come good, we found out that we didn't have a lot of problem with that. Well, going back to insect spray, if you spray out the insects, you spray out the predators as well. What we're looking for really is a balance, so the predators can handle the insects if they go. I mean, even with your clovers and your grasses, clovers put the nitrogen into the ground, and your grasses use it, so you'll get a certain amount of balance to be made there too. We did put out the lime and dolomite. Well, we did take soil samples, and that. But well, there's one little thing my mother taught me: all that you do with your might. Things done by halves are never done right. We seem to end up with the never done right part. So no, it's just one of those learning curves there. So yeah, we did manage to build a hay shed and a workshop, car shed, etc. Welded, well, Lester designed the shed, but we haven't maintained it like we should. In the dairy, when that was built, I welded up all the bales and that. You can tell that by the rough wheels. Didn't perfect it, though we did a lot of work for ourselves. The other thing that might have been of interest to you is when we were at Mount Mary, we were the first ones to have a hot water system in the house in that area at that time. It was worked off a wood stove with a coil in it and a little 30-gallon tank fitted with the right inlets and outlets and etc. Well, when we moved, we brought that with us, and so I put that up in that loft of the dairy there alongside their other electric hot water service as a preheater with solar pads on the roof. So we made use of that there. So I don't really know how much it saved us in power or not, but that's another thing that the solar pads aren't new to us as far as hot water is concerned.
I'm a city girl, really, and when I came in touch with the League of Rights, of course, I came across a whole lot of farmers and natural health and good food, all of that. And Frank Borden taught me a lot. Now, one of the things that always made me curious was why was it that organic farmers or biodynamic farmers would have greener grasses when around about them, their neighbours, the grass would dry quicker, earlier. And I can tell you, and interestingly, because I've wondered this for a long, long time, and it was just recently I got onto that female doctor, Christine Jones, who was working with the West Australian farmers. Oh, yeah. And of course, I've read about humus millions of times, and I've done my best to see that I feed my garden, the mulch on top, the lot. But and I looked up humus in the dictionary, and of course it's talking about the organic matter that is going to disintegrate and go into the soil. But no, humus is when the fungi gathers around the roots of the plant, and the fungi between the roots of the plant and the fungi, which is part of the microbe life, that the water is held in suspension in there. The water is held in suspension, and that the dictionary doesn't tell us that. Now, how about that?
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I didn't. Well, it's when your soil is so barren that your bacteria and fungi and whatnot just aren't in existence. But it's amazing where it comes back. What comes back after it gets a chance. Same with earthworms now. When I run this Wallace machine through, I've got magpies and herons following me around, sort of thing. But prior to that, you wouldn't find a worm in the ground anywhere. I mean, it's there all the time, but it's dormant until the conditions are right.
Now, have a look at that. I was looking at something from the Murray-Darling Basin recently. It's on these, they're asking for submissions and giving you guidelines and generally trying to find out what farmers are doing. Water conservation farming now is frowned upon, as is planting trees. You're stopping the water from getting down into the rivers and dams where the government or the quangos can sell it off. Oh, it's fair income. And keyline farming is, it's a sort of a bit of a no-no. They don't come straight out and tell you, but water harvesting is. And they're not very keen on it. So there you go.
You know, one other little thing that I don't think very many dairy farmers are talking about milking cows in poor weather, and they don't always lie down in the right place either, and you get poo-eaters and whatnot. We've even gone to the extent of putting a little brush on the end of the hose where we wash the things. So, you know, you use a nail brush when you can't get the dirt off. Well, a little brush on the hose, that helps, you know. Marvellous invention.
Could you tell us a little about the health of your animals? And what's your opinion on forced pasteurization of milk for general consumption, please?
Well, when we used artificial fertiliser and the pasture, etc., grew rankly, we did have bloat problems. And well, what we do, or have been doing for a mighty long time, well, I didn't actually talk about electric fencing yet, have I? Each little paddock we divide into 3 strips, put electric fence from the laneway to the back fence, but we put a wire across the laneway to give them their ration twice a day. That's been routine for yonks. The idea of that is that if the cows go out in the pasture and they get a real belly full of fresh pasture with the dew on it and all the rest of it, they're likely to bloat. Well, they don't survive too well with bloat. And Harry had to buy one of these cannulas and trocars, you know? There's a little patch on the side of the cow just in front of the hip there, a little triangle soft patch. And that blows up real tight, plus all the stomach, the heart can't beat and the lungs can't
It's on
breathe.
the left-hand side too.
Pardon?
It's on the left-hand side.
Left-hand side. Did I say the right?
Yeah,
left-hand
other
side.
people might know.
And in goes the thing, and you pull out the stabber and the dagger in the middle, and it leaves a little hole about, what, ½ an inch in diameter. And it's like taking the valve out of a tyre. You sort of back away. But that's the only way to save a cow in a critical position like that. We've saved quite a few. But since we've gone away from chemical fertilisers, and the other thing we do now is always feed hay before they go out on pasture, so that they've got something in their stomach and they don't guts away to their heart's content. And by giving their ration of pasture twice a day, you keep them off trampling the rest of it and spoiling it, so that then the pasture's got a chance to grow ahead and regrow behind the strip that they've already grazed. And when we put out the liquid manure from the washings of the yard, that's always behind the cows. So by the time they're rotated around the whole area that they're grazing, they don't mind grazing that patch where we put the manure. It's old enough and the grass is regrown well enough so that they don't reject it.
Would you agree that a definition of a farmer would be a handyman with a good sense of humour?
He'd have to. Sometimes it's frustrating to get the sense of humour around. I'm sure. Yes. No, you live and learn by your mistakes. The only thing is you've got to remember.
Harry, I want to get a bit personal here and ask you, we know about Brenton and David. I'd like to know a couple of things. How many people does your farm support, and how long did it take you to get out of debt, or are you still there? Because it seems to me that small is always beautiful, and lots of small farmers like you are much better than a very large farm that's deeply in debt and relying on chemicals and fertilisers and what have you. And that's the way modern farming is oriented.
Well, I suppose we were lucky in a lot of ways, but didn't realise it at the time. My father-in-law did help us to get onto the property, and you're wondering why we bought such a horrible rundown property in the first place. Crossed your mind, did it? We wanted to give our children a Christian education. We're only 4 miles from St Michael's School. See, the schools out in the Mallee, Mount Mary School closed when I think the lads were only just started, and that. Next thing, the Bower School closed not many years after that. We actually had the school teacher living with us. He was a single guy at the time, first school I think it was, and he'd take our kids in our car and go to Bower to teach the school kids. But that eventually closed, so Yadunda was the next place. But we wanted to have a Christian education, so that's why we did move onto that property. And the other thing was that we had a pump on the river where we had water. There's no bore on that place. The site's been picked, but with the bureaucracy nowadays, we haven't got, well, they cost a bit to put down, and we haven't got around to it, so we have often seen the bottom of the Onkaparinga, put it that way. But we've always had enough spring water in that to have stock and garden water. So, but one of the main reasons was to give our lads a Christian education. We had 4 lads, and they ended up going to Concordia College. Lester, the oldest one, he got an apprenticeship with the Electricity Trust. He was an electrical fitter, but he wormed his way through the system, and he was interested in computers, and he ended up with Western Mining. They took him to Melbourne for a year, I think, and then they transferred him to Perth, and he's been there for the last, Katrina was in grade 3, and now she's got two children, about 18 years or something. David, the one that was here yesterday, he got an apprenticeship with Acromat. Stuart, the one that's up at Roxby Downs now, he got an apprenticeship in motor mechanic. But Brenton was there when the apprenticeships were fizzled out. So there was a neighbour around the back from where we lived there doing motor repairs and that, so he did his unofficial apprenticeship with him there, so he had experience in repairing motor vehicles and that sort of thing. And well, when things got above me, so he come back home again and did work on the place there now, and he's sort of stuck with it, I suppose. So it's a constant job.